All right, so you've given us like a mountain of material on this self-improvement and happiness kick, huh?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking philosophy, psychology, even some rock and roll rebels.
Yeah, it's quite a mix.
But the mission for this deep dive, we got to figure out why learning to give fewer, better fucks might, just might, be like the key to a good life.
Right. And what I find fascinating is that all these sources, even though they have different approaches, they kind of agree that we're often trying so hard to be happy that it actually gets in the way.
Huh. So it's like the pursuit of happiness is what's making us unhappy.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay, so let's jump right in. One of the sources argues that this whole obsession our culture has with positivity, it might actually backfire. Makes us more anxious, more self-critical. Have you ever felt that?
All the time. It's like you see everyone on social media and everyone seems so happy and successful.
Right.
Makes you feel like you're not doing enough.
Yeah, like you're failing somehow.
Exactly. It's like that feedback loop from hell described in The Subtle Art.
It's so true. Like, it reminds me of this, one of the articles talked about this woman at the grocery store, and she's like throwing a tantrum over a 30-cent coupon.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
It seems like so trivial.
It is.
But it makes you think about how fixating on what we don't have can just create so much stress.
Totally. The author uses that anecdote to show how focusing on what's wrong just makes it feel worse.
So how do we like break free from that?
Well, the sources seem to agree that happiness, it's not about avoiding problems altogether.
Oh, interesting. So it's not about just having a perfect problem-free life.
Nope. It's more about choosing the right problems to solve.
Choosing your struggles.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what challenges are you willing to embrace? What pain are you willing to go through to get what you actually want out of life?
Huh. That makes me think of those musicians, Dave Mustaine and Pete Best. They were both, like, rejected early on in their careers. But they took really different paths.
Oh, yeah. Good example.
So Mustaine, he gets kicked out of Metallica, and he goes on to have massive success with Megadeth.
Ugh.
But he was, like, fixated on Metallica, always comparing himself, never really seemed happy.
Right, whereas Pete Best, the drummer who got replaced right before the Beatles became huge, he focused on building a family, a stable life, didn't achieve that level of fame, but his choices reflected his values,
That's so powerful. So external success doesn't always equal internal happiness, right?
It really comes down to what matters to you. What are you willing to struggle for?
And that takes self-awareness. A lot of the sources talk about how dangerous entitlement can be.
Oh, yeah, that entitlement thing.
And it can manifest in different ways, right?
Yeah.
Like thinking you're better than everyone else or thinking you're a victim all the time.
Absolutely. There's that story about the guy who blamed his height for not having success with women.
Oh, right. He just couldn't see how his own behavior might be the problem.
Exactly. And that's where the responsibility piece comes in. We're responsible for our emotions and reactions, even when we're not at fault for the situation.
So it's like responsibility and fault, not the same thing.
Nope, not at all.
Another interesting idea that came up was this tyranny of exceptionalism. Like, we're bombarded with these stories of exceptional people. Makes it hard to feel like our own lives are good enough.
It's tough. Like, we're always comparing ourselves to the best of the best.
Yeah. It reminds me of that story about Hiro Onoda, the Japanese soldier who hid in the jungle for, like, decades after World War II ended. He refused to believe the war was over.
Oh, wow.
He was so stuck in his own reality, he missed out on years of life.
That's intense.
It is. So if chasing exceptional is a trap, how do we find meaning and purpose in a world that's constantly telling us we're not enough? What were your thoughts on that?
Well, that's where the power of saying no comes in, I think.
Saying no.
Yeah, being able to reject alternatives, set boundaries. It's crucial for finding depth and meaning in anything, really.
I used to struggle so much with saying no. Like, I would try to please everyone, but it left me feeling, like, drained, unfulfilled.
It's a common struggle. And the author, he uses this example of his trip to Russia.
Russia.
Yeah, he found the Russian culture, like the blunt honesty, really jarring at first. But then he realized it was incredibly liberating.
So different cultures, different values around honesty and directness.
Exactly. And it's about defining those values for yourself. What are you willing to say no to create the life you actually want?
This leads us to another big theme, embracing failure.
So important.
We tend to see failure as a setback, but the sources say it's essential for learning and growth.
Couldn't agree more.
It's like that story about Picasso, the woman who was outraged that he wanted to charge thousands of dollars for a napkin drawing. But she didn't see the decades of practice, the countless tiny failures that led to that mastery.
Right, mastery takes time and a lot of messing up along the way.
The author talks about entering the job market during the Great Recession. Starting his career at rock bottom made him embrace failure early on.
He had nothing to lose.
Right. And that mindset shift allowed him to experiment, learn, and ultimately, find success on his own terms.
Love that story. So inspiring.
It is. It makes you realize that sometimes those big failures can actually lead to the greatest opportunities.
For sure. And if you're feeling stuck, the sources offer this simple but powerful idea, the do something principle.
Okay, tell me more about this do something principle.
It's all about, taking action, even when it's small, even if you don't know exactly what you're doing.
Just do something.
Yeah, it creates momentum. Inspiration will follow. The author talks about simply cleaning his desk when he felt unmotivated.
Oh, okay, so even something small.
Exactly. Or writing, like 200 crappy words a day, making that difficult phone call. Just showing up, even when you don't feel like it.
Getting out of our heads and into our lives.
Yes. It's about shifting that mindset from I'll do it when I feel like it to I'll feel like it when I do it.
And speaking of relationships, that's one area where this idea of saying no is so important.
Oh, absolutely. The author, he talks about his years of traveling, and initially he had this say yes to everything mentality, but it left him feeling empty,
Yeah, I get it.
True, meaning, he argues, it comes from choosing what to say no to.
Choosing what to say no to. I love that.
It's powerful. It reminds me of actually a trip I took to Russia.
Oh.
Yeah. At first, I was kind of shocked by how blunt people were. It felt, jarring compared to how we usually communicate.
Right.
But as I spent more time there, I began to appreciate it. It was liberating.
Interesting. So it really challenged your own cultural norms.
Oh, totally. Made me realize the power of authentic expression and the importance of setting clear boundaries in all relationships.
And speaking of those relationships, the sources really dive into the complexities of healthy and unhealthy connections, setting boundaries, being willing to give and receive rejection. It's all there.
Yeah, and the author's analysis of those victim and saver archetypes, it's really insightful.
I'd love to hear more about that. What stood out to you about those?
Well, the victim, they always blame others for their problems. And the saver, they constantly try to fix everyone else's problem.
Like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they both come from a lack of healthy boundaries.
So we have to learn to say no, to set clear boundaries, and to allow others to be responsible for their own choices, even when we care about them.
It's tough, but so important.
Now, the source material also talks about this idea of, like, the tyranny of exceptionalism. We're constantly bombarded with these stories of exceptional people, which can lead to, like, unrealistic expectations for our own lives.
It's like we're constantly comparing ourselves to the best, the brightest, the most successful. It's hard not to feel inadequate sometimes.
Totally. It's like that story of Hiro Onoda, the Japanese soldier who stayed hidden in the jungle for decades after World War II ended. He refused to believe the war was over.
Oh, wow.
He was so fixated on his own version of reality that he missed out on years of life.
It's amazing how our minds can cling to those beliefs even when they're clearly not serving us.
Absolutely. And it's not just about, like, factual information either. It's also about these ideas we have about ourselves, about what it means to be successful, about what it means to be happy.
Right. We buy into these narratives, these stories that we're told about how life should be.
And sometimes those stories are limiting us. They're preventing us from seeing the bigger picture.
I think that's where the importance of self-awareness comes in, like being able to step back and question those narratives.
And being willing to let go of them if they're not serving us. And being willing to write our own stories.
Absolutely.
Now, before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more theme that emerged from the sources, and it's the idea of interconnectedness. Recognizing that our individual choices and actions have ripple effects that extend far beyond ourselves.
That's an important one because, so much of what we've been discussing has been focused on the individual, right? On self-awareness, on taking responsibility for our own lives, on choosing our own struggles.
Right.
But it's also important to acknowledge that we're not isolated beings. We're part of a larger web of interconnectedness. And our actions, our choices, they have consequences for others.
So how do we balance this focus on the individual with a recognition of our interconnectedness?
I think it starts with empathy and compassion. both for ourselves and for others.
Empathy and compassion.
Yeah. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, that we're all facing our own unique challenges, and that we all have the potential to make a positive impact on the world.
I love that. It's about seeing ourselves as part of something larger than ourselves.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that our personal growth, it's not just about us. It's also about contributing to the well-being of the collective.
It really makes you think about the ripple effects of our choices, doesn't it?
It does.
All right, well, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue exploring these ideas and dive even deeper into the practical applications of all this. Stay with us.
It really does. And, makes me think about the author of The Subtle Art. He talks about how, for a long time, he thought he just didn't care about anything.
Really?
Yeah, but then he realized it wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he was afraid to care.
Afraid to care. What do you mean by that?
Well, he was afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of, being judged, being rejected, all that stuff.
That makes sense. It's scary to put yourself out there.
It is. But when he finally allowed himself to care, to connect, to be open about his feelings, his values, that's when he discovered a whole new level of meaning and purpose.
So fear can actually hold us back from experiencing like deeper connection and meaning?
Totally. And it makes me think about how important it is to, create those safe spaces where we can be ourselves, be vulnerable without fear of judgment.
Absolutely. And that makes me think about the importance of choosing our communities wisely, surrounding ourselves with people who support our growth, who encourage us to be our true selves.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of growth, I think this idea of interconnectedness, it also ties back to what we were talking about earlier, about taking responsibility for our lives.
Oh, you're right, because if we acknowledge that our choices have an impact on others, then it raises the stakes for taking responsibility for those choices, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's not just about our own individual happiness anymore. It's about recognizing that our actions, they have consequences. They ripple out. They affect the people around us. They affect the world around us.
So how do we even begin to grapple with that? With that level of responsibility? I mean, it feels kind of daunting, doesn't it?
It can be. It can be overwhelming. But I think the author, he offers some helpful guidance. He says it starts with understanding the difference between responsibility and fault.
I'd love to hear more about that. How do you see those two concepts getting confused?
Well, we often assume that if something bad happens, somebody must be to blame.
Right.
But the author, he makes the point that we can be responsible for a situation without actually being at fault for it.
Okay, I'm following you.
So, he uses this example of, imagine you find a baby on your doorstep.
Okay, I have a baby on a doorstep.
Right. Now, you didn't put the baby there, so it's not your fault. But you are now responsible for what happens to that baby.
That's a really powerful illustration.
It is.
So responsibility, it's not about assigning blame. It's about recognizing that we have agency. We have the power to choose how we respond to any situation.
Exactly. And those choices, even the ones we make when we're not at fault, they have consequences. And it's about owning those consequences and learning from them.
So how do we get better at recognizing our responsibility without getting bogged down in guilt or blame? What did the sources have to say about that?
One of the key things they emphasized was the importance of becoming aware of our emotional blind spots. Those patterns, those reactions that we're not even aware of.
Oh, yeah.
The things that trip us up, that keep us stuck in these unhealthy cycles.
It's like those moments where we react in a way that surprises even ourselves.
Yeah.
And we're like, wait, where did that come from?
Right, exactly. And those reactions, they often stem from, unresolved emotional baggage. Past experiences that have shaped us in ways we don't even realize.
So how do we start to uncover those blind spots? What advice do the sources offer?
Well, the author talks about his own experience with social anxiety. And, he spent years avoiding situations that made him uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But then he realized that avoiding those situations was actually making his anxiety worse.
Oh, so it was like the avoidance was actually feeding the anxiety.
Exactly. And it was only when he started to confront his fears, to put himself in those uncomfortable situations, that he began to actually overcome his anxiety.
It's like facing your fears head on.
Yeah, and that ties back to that do something principle we were talking about. Taking action, even when it's scary, even when you don't know what the outcome will be.
Right.
It's about facing those fears, acknowledging our limitations, and choosing to move forward anyway.
I love that. It's about recognizing that growth happens outside of our comfort zone.
Exactly. And it's also about learning to set boundaries. The author, he tells this story about how he used to be a total people pleaser.
Oh.
Always saying yes to everyone and everything.
Oh, yeah. I know that feeling. It's like you're so afraid to disappoint anyone.
Right. And it often stems from a fear of rejection or a need for external validation. But what the author learned was that learning to say no, it's essential. It protects your time, your energy, your emotional well-being.
It's about honoring our own needs and limits, right?
Exactly.
But that can be really challenging, especially when it involves people we care about. What advice do the sources offer for setting boundaries in a way that's both compassionate and effective?
One of the key things they emphasize is being clear and direct in our communication. Using those I statements to express our needs and boundaries without blaming the other person.
Oh, so instead of saying, you're always making demands on my time,
right, yeah.
You would say, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now and I need some time for myself.
Exactly. And it's also important to be consistent with our boundaries. If we say no to something and then we give in the next time, it just sends mixed messages.
It does. It makes it harder to maintain those boundaries in the future.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's also about being willing to have those uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
Because, setting boundaries, it's not always going to be easy. It can lead to conflict.
Sure.
But those conflicts, they can actually be opportunities.
For growth.
For deeper understanding.
And it's about learning to navigate those difficult conversations with grace, with compassion.
Absolutely. And recognizing that, we don't have to fix everyone's problems. We can offer support. We can offer empathy. But ultimately, each individual, they're responsible for their own choices, their own journey.
It's about empowering others to find their own solutions rather than trying to rescue them or control the outcome.
Exactly. And it's also about letting go of the need to be right. We all have that tendency, right, to cling to our beliefs, even when they're no longer serving us.
I think that's a very human thing to do. We get attached to our ideas, our opinions, our worldviews. It can be hard to let go, even when we know we need to.
It's hard. But the author, he describes this fascinating experiment where they put people in a room and they gave them these buttons to push, and they told them that if they did certain things, a light would flash and they would earn points.
Okay.
But here's the thing. The points were completely random. There was no actual pattern.
So they were being rewarded for random actions.
Essentially, yes.
Wow.
And yet these people, they developed these elaborate theories about how to earn points. They became completely convinced that their actions were causing the light to flash.
That's incredible.
It is. And it just shows how easily we can deceive ourselves. Yeah. How our brains are wired to find patterns, to create meaning, even when there is none.
So we're all just walking around making up stories about why things happen the way they do.
In a way, yes.
And those stories, those narratives, they can be so powerful.
They are. They shape our beliefs, our perceptions, our experiences.
But they can also be limiting. If we're clinging to a story that's no longer serving us, it can prevent us from seeing new possibilities.
For sure. And that's why the author encourages us to develop this healthy skepticism towards our own beliefs.
Healthy skepticism.
Yeah. Be willing to question our assumptions. Be open to new information. Recognize that our perspective, it's just one perspective,
So it's about being humble.
It is.
Recognizing that we don't have all the answers. Being open to learning from others.
Exactly. And it's about being more compassionate with ourselves and with others. We all make mistakes. We all have blind spots. We're all just doing the best we can.
We are. So instead of judging ourselves or others so harshly, we can choose to approach life with more curiosity, more empathy, more sense of humor even.
Exactly. It doesn't mean we have to lower our standards or condone bad behavior.
Yeah.
But it does mean recognizing that we're all on a journey.
Right.
We're all works in progress.
And we're all interconnected. Our actions have an impact on others.
Mm-hmm.
And we have this responsibility to use our gifts and talents to make the world a better place.
Couldn't agree more.
Speaking of gifts and talents, I want to touch on one of the most, I think, fascinating and challenging concepts that the author explores. It's this idea that our values, they actually shape our reality.
That's a big one.
It is. He argues that our values are essentially the things we give a fuck about.
Oh, okay, yeah, like the things that truly matter to us.
Yeah. They're the principles, the beliefs that guide our decisions, our actions, our interpretations of the world. And he distinguishes between, good values and bad values.
Oh, interesting. So what makes a good value?
Well, he says good values, they're reality-based. They're achievable. They're within our control. While bad values, they're often, arbitrary, unsustainable. They lead to these unhealthy attachments.
That makes sense.
And he uses this example of those two musicians we talked about earlier, Dave Mustaine and Pete Best. Both of them faced rejection early in their careers, but they had very different values. And those values led them to very different outcomes.
Oh, yeah. That was a powerful example.
So, Mustaine, he was obsessed with outdoing his former bandmates, proving that he was better than them. And he achieved a lot of commercial success.
Yeah.
But he remained, deeply unhappy.
Right. He was constantly measuring himself against this external standard.
Exactly. And it was a standard that he couldn't control. He couldn't control what other people thought of him or how successful they were.
It's like he was chasing a ghost.
He was. Pete Best, on the other hand, he chose a different path. He focused on building a family, having a stable career, living a life that was aligned with his values. He didn't achieve the same level of fame or fortune as the Beatles, but he found a deep sense of fulfillment.
So external achievements don't always equate to inner peace and happiness.
They don't. It really all comes back to those values that we choose to prioritize.
And being honest with ourselves about what those values are.
The author, he urges us to ask ourselves this really tough question. He says, what pain are you willing to endure? What struggles do you want to have in your life? Those are heavy questions, but they force us to confront what truly matters.
We do.
To make sure that we're not sacrificing our well-being in pursuit of goals that are not aligned with our values.
And to choose our struggles wisely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He also encourages us to be mindful of the values that are prevalent in our culture.
Yeah.
To question whether those values are actually serving us. Because let's be honest, our society often promotes values that are pretty superficial.
Oh, yeah.
Materialistic and ultimately unsustainable.
Like what? Like what kind of values?
Well, this constant chasing after the next big thing, the comparing ourselves to others, the trying to be perfect, always striving for more, never feeling content.
It's exhausting.
It is exhausting. And it can lead us down a path of emptiness and dissatisfaction.
So how do we break free from those cultural traps? How do we cultivate values that are more authentic, more fulfilling?
It's a process of self-discovery, of reflection. It's about taking the time to connect with our own inner wisdom, to listen to our intuition, to figure out what truly matters to us.
To define success on our own terms.
Exactly. And it's about being willing to let go of the things that no longer serve us, even if those things are, culturally valued or expected of us.
It takes courage to do that.
It does. And it's about recognizing that true fulfillment, it doesn't come from external achievements. It comes from living a life that is congruent with our values. It's about aligning our actions with our beliefs and creating a life that feels authentic and meaningful to us.
I love that. It's about living in integrity.
It is. And that brings us back to this idea of saying no.
Ah, there it is again.
The ability to say no, to reject alternatives, to set boundaries. The author, he argues that this is one of the most important skills we can develop if we want to create a life that is both fulfilling and sustainable. And it's not just about saying no to other people. It's also about saying no to certain parts of ourselves.
That's interesting.
To certain impulses, to certain desires that are not aligned with our values.
It's about having that self-awareness, right?
It is. It's about recognizing that we have a choice in every moment.
We do.
We can choose to say yes to the things that nourish us, that support our growth, that bring us joy. And we can choose to say no to the things that drain us, that distract us, that lead us away from our true path.
So it's about taking back our power.
It is. It's about making conscious choices about how we want to spend our time, our energy, our attention.
Love that.
And it's about recognizing that saying no is not selfish. It's an act of self-care. It's about honoring our own needs and limits and creating space for the things that truly matter. And the author, he explores this concept in a variety of contexts.
Yeah.
From romantic relationships to career choices to our interactions with family and friends.
Right. And he uses his experience traveling to Russia as an example.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more about that.
Well, he talks about how, the blunt honesty of Russian culture, it was really jarring at first.
Right.
But ultimately he found it liberating.
It made him question the way we communicate in the West.
Yeah, all those superficial niceties. And it made him realize the value of just being authentic, of expressing himself directly.
It's interesting how different cultures have such different norms around communication.
It is. And I think his experience, it highlights the importance of being aware of those differences and of finding a communication style that feels authentic and comfortable for you.
Right. It's not about being rude or disrespectful. It's about being honest and direct in a way that feels true to yourself.
And he also shares this personal anecdote about learning to be honest with his wife.
Oh, interesting.
Even when it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
He talks about how the ability to say no, to express his true feelings, his opinions, it's essential for maintaining a healthy relationship.
It's about creating that space where both partners feel safe to be themselves,
yes,
to disagree, to have different perspectives,
to work through those differences.
And it's about recognizing that disagreement, that conflict. It's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. It can actually be an opportunity for growth, for
Yeah.
deeper understanding.
Absolutely. And it's about learning to navigate those difficult conversations
With grace.
with compassion.
Yeah. And remembering that, you don't have to agree on everything to have a loving and fulfilling relationship.
You don't.
You can have different opinions, different beliefs, different ways of seeing the world, and still love and respect each other. The key is finding a way to navigate those differences in a way that strengthens the relationship.
Rather than tearing it apart.
Exactly. And the author, he also talks about, those unhealthy relationship patterns we were talking about earlier, the victim, the saver.
Oh, yeah, those archetypes.
Right. And he encourages us to take responsibility for our own lives, to set clear boundaries, and to allow others to be responsible for their own choices.
Even when it's hard.
Even when it's hard, because, we can't control other people's behavior.
We can't.
But we can control our own responses.
And those responses, they shape our reality, don't they?
They do.
So it's about learning to detach with love, to offer support without enabling, to allow others to experience the natural consequences of their choices.
It's tough, but it's so important.
And speaking of romantic relationships, the author, he also challenges this cultural obsession that we have with romantic love.
Oh, it's interesting.
He argues that all these narratives that we've been fed about, finding the one and living happily ever after, that they can be misleading. They can even be harmful. It's like we've been sold this fairy tale version of love.
And it sets us up for disappointment.
Exactly. And he argues that true intimacy, true connection, it's built on a foundation of trust, of respect, and a willingness to both give and receive rejection.
To be real with each other.
Yeah, it's about choosing a partner whose values are aligned with your own, and then being willing to do the work.
Because relationships take work.
They do.
Yeah.
And he uses his own marriage as an example. He talks about how important it is for him to be able to be completely honest with his wife.
Yeah.
Even when it's uncomfortable.
That vulnerability.
Yeah. He says that the ability to say no, to express his true feelings, his opinions, it's essential for their relationship.
It creates that safety.
It does. It creates that space where they can both be themselves, where they can disagree, where they can have different perspectives, and they can work through those differences. And it's about recognizing that disagreements, that conflicts, those are not necessarily signs that the relationship is doomed.
Right. They can actually be opportunities to deepen intimacy and understanding.
Exactly.
The key is how you approach those conflicts.
Yeah.
With respect, with compassion, with a willingness to compromise, and remembering that you're on the same team.
You're both working towards the same goal.
Exactly, a loving and fulfilling relationship. And speaking of challenges in relationships, the author, he also touches on the topic of infidelity.
Okay.
He argues that cheating is ultimately a failure of values, a lack of self-awareness.
He really challenges that narrative that we often hear, right?
Yeah, the whole I don't know what I was thinking thing.
Yeah.
He's saying, look, if someone cheats, it's because something other than the relationship is more important to them. Maybe it's a need for validation. Maybe it's a fear of intimacy. Maybe it's a lack of self-control. But whatever the reason, it's a sign that their values, they're not aligned with the commitment that they've made.
It's a tough thing to acknowledge, but I think it's an important point.
It is. And it's important to remember that we all have the right to choose partners who share our values and who are committed to creating a relationship based on trust and fidelity. And the author, he doesn't offer any easy answers when it comes to relationships. He acknowledges that they're messy, they're complicated.
They are.
But he does offer some valuable insights, some guiding principles for navigating those complexities, for creating relationships that are based on honesty, on respect, on a shared commitment to growth.
It's about choosing our partners wisely. It's about communicating our needs clearly. It's about setting those healthy boundaries.
And being willing to do the work.
It is. It's about putting in the effort to create something that's both loving and fulfilling.
Absolutely. And speaking of work, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the realm of career and purpose. One of the themes that emerges from the source material is this idea that finding meaningful work, it's not just about finding a job that pays the bills. It's about aligning our work with our values, with our passions.
It's about finding a way to use our skills and talents to make a positive impact, even if it's a small way.
I love that.
And the author talks about how, he initially pursued a career path that was based on external validation.
Yeah.
On financial success.
Right.
But he eventually realized that it wasn't fulfilling him.
It wasn't lighting him up.
It wasn't. It felt like he was going through the motions, but his heart wasn't really in it.
It happens.
It does. And so he started to explore his passions. He experimented with different types of work, and eventually he found a path that felt more aligned with his values, more aligned with his sense of purpose. And it's an inspiring reminder that it's never too late to make a change.
It's never too late.
It's never too late to pursue work that brings us joy, that brings us fulfillment.
Absolutely.
And it's also a reminder that meaningful work, it doesn't have to look a certain way. It doesn't have to be glamorous. It doesn't have to be, high paying. It can be anything that allows us to use our gifts, our talents to make a positive contribution.
Right. It's all about how you define it.
It is. It can be volunteering our time. It can be starting a side hustle. It could be simply bringing more intention, more purpose to our current work.
Yeah, it's about finding that connection.
It is.
Yep.
It's about finding that connection to something that feels bigger than ourselves, something that gives us that sense of meaning, that sense of purpose, and remembering that our work, it's not our identity.
It's not.
It's just one aspect of our lives.
Yeah.
And it's important to create balance, to create space for other things that matter, our families, our friends, our hobbies, self-care.
Right. All the things that make life rich and full.
Oh, exactly. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to one of the key messages that we've been talking about throughout this conversation. Right. And it's this idea of taking action.
Yes, action.
The author of The Subtle Art.
Mm-hmm.
He reminds us over and over again that action is the antidote to fear, to procrastination, to stagnation.
And he gets us unstuck.
It does. He encourages us to embrace this do something principle.
To take that first step.
Even when we don't feel like it.
Yeah.
Even when we're afraid. Even when we don't know what the outcome will be.
Because action creates momentum.
And momentum creates inspiration.
And inspiration often leads to breakthroughs, to opportunities.
It does. The author shares so many examples of how this principle has worked in his own life.
It's powerful stuff.
And he encourages us to apply it to any area of our lives where we're feeling stuck.
Wherever we're feeling that resistance.
Yeah. So if you're feeling paralyzed by fear, by doubt, remember these words. Do something. Anything. Just start. Take that first step.
It doesn't have to be perfect.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
And you never know where it might lead.
You never know.
And remember, failure, it's not the opposite of success. It's a part of success.
It's how we learn.
Every time we fail, we learn something. We gain experience. We become more resilient. And we get closer to our goals, even if it doesn't always feel that way in the moment.
It's all part of the process.
It is. So embrace the stumbles. Embrace the setbacks. Embrace the detours.
They're all part of the journey.
They are. Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. The journey of self-improvement, it's not a linear path. It's messy, it's winding, it's full of twists and turns, it's full of ups and downs.
There will be detours, there will be roadblocks.
There will be. But it's in those moments when you feel lost, when you feel confused, when you feel discouraged, it's in those moments that it's most important to remember your why.
Your why.
Why are you on this journey? What are you striving for? What kind of life do you want to create?
Connect to your values, connect to your passions, connect to your purpose.
And trust. Trust that you're exactly where you need to be.
You are. Embrace the journey. Embrace the uncertainty. Embrace the growth. And most importantly, embrace yourself. Because you are worthy. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of happiness. You are worthy of fulfillment. And you have the power to create the life of your dreams.
We're going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we'll wrap up this deep dive with some final reflections and key takeaways. Stay with us.
You are, and it's so easy to get caught up in all the shoulds and the have-tos of life.
It is, isn't it?
And we lose sight of what really matters, of what really lights us up.
We do. It's like we're all just going through the motions.
Yeah.
But not really living.
And that's why it's so important to carve out that time for reflection, for introspection, for connecting with that inner wisdom.
Yeah. To ask ourselves those big questions.
The big ones.
Like what do I really want? What brings me joy? What makes me feel alive?
Exactly. And then to have the courage to actually pursue those things.
Even if they're like unconventional.
Right.
Even if they're outside of the norm.
It's about creating a life that's aligned with who you are, with your values, with your passions, with your purpose, and recognizing that life might look very different from what society tells us it should look like.
And speaking of those societal expectations, I want to touch on one of the most, I think, profound and perhaps controversial messages that emerged from the source material.
Okay.
It's this idea that we are ultimately responsible for everything in our lives.
Mm.
And this can be a really difficult concept to grasp.
It can.
Especially when we've been through, challenging experiences or even traumatic experiences.
Right. It's natural to want to blame others, to feel like we're victims of circumstance.
It is. But the author, he argues that taking ownership of our lives, even the painful parts, it's essential for growth. Mm-hmm. It's essential for creating a life that's truly our own.
It's about empowerment.
It is. It's about recognizing that we always have a choice. Even in the midst of adversity.
Always a choice.
We can choose to be victims. Or we can choose to find meaning and growth in those challenges. And it's not about denying the pain. It's not about pretending that everything's okay.
Right.
It's about recognizing that even in the darkest of times, we still have that power to choose our response.
Yes, to choose our narrative.
To create a narrative that empowers us to move forward.
Exactly.
And he uses the example of his own experience with heartbreak. And how he eventually came to realize that while his ex-girlfriend, she was to blame for her actions, he was responsible for his own healing.
Right. He couldn't control her behavior.
He couldn't.
But he could control how he responded to it.
And those responses, they shaped his reality, didn't they?
They did. They determined whether he was going to stay stuck in that pain and resentment or whether he was going to find a way to grow and learn from the experience.
And he chose to grow. He chose to learn. And I think that's such a powerful message. We always have that choice.
We do. And it's a choice that we make in every moment.
It is. Now, the sources, they also challenge us to examine the stories that we tell ourselves, the narratives that we buy into.
The stories we tell ourselves.
We're constantly bombarded with these messages about what it means to be successful, what it means to be happy, what it means to be fulfilled.
Right. And those messages aren't always true.
They're not. And it's important to be critical of those narratives.
Yeah.
And to develop our own internal compass.
Our own inner knowing.
For what truly matters. Mm-hmm. And it takes self-awareness. It takes a willingness to question our beliefs. And it takes a commitment to ongoing growth.
To keep learning.
To keep learning. To keep evolving. To keep becoming.
And to be compassionate along the way.
Yes. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. It's been a really rich and thought-provoking conversation.
It has.
And I think the biggest takeaway for me is this idea that we have a choice. We have a choice in every moment.
We do.
We can choose to focus on the things that drain us, that bring us down, that make us feel small and insignificant. Or we can choose to focus on the things that lift us up, that inspire us, that make us feel alive and connected to something bigger than ourselves.
So it's about choosing where we direct our energy.
It is. And it's about remembering that we are not alone. We are all in this together. And we all have the power to create a life that is both meaningful and fulfilling.
Absolutely.
So go out there and give fewer better fucks.
And create a life that you're proud of.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.